The Thorn homestead, a cluster of weather-beaten structures that had stood against countless winters, had once hummed with the vibrant thrum of prosperity, a beacon of human tenacity against nature's vast indifference. Now it merely clung to existence, a ship listing heavily under the crushing weight of overdue payments and the ceaseless, relentless march of winter. Each gust of wind a reminder of his dwindling reserves. The farm, inherited from his grandfather, who in turn had received it from his own, carried with it not just the promise of sustenance, but the unspoken burden of generations. Elias remembered his father, a man of few words but immense strength, telling him on a crisp autumn evening, some 30 years prior, that the land was both a blessing and a curse, a relentless mistress demanding constant vigilance, unwavering effort. That memory now felt like a distant, cruel whisper, mocking his current predicament. A quiet, insidious desperation had begun to settle deep within him, a chill more profound and penetrating than any frost that coated the window panes. He would wake sometimes, in the dead of night, to the groan of the old house, imagining it was the very spirit of the farm, exhaling its last, weary breath. He was alone, utterly alone, with only the stark, unyielding landscape for company, and the heavy metallic taste of failure lingering on his tongue. Every fence post he hammered, every broken hinge he mended, felt less like an act of preservation and more like a futile, desperate delaying tactic against an inevitable collapse. One frigid morning, as the sun, a pale, watery disk, struggled to burn through the thin veil of mist clinging to the eastern peaks, Elias spotted it. A large, lean grey wolf, its breath pluming in the biting, sub-zero air like miniature clouds, stood with an almost unsettling stillness near the far edge of his sheep pasture. Its coat, a magnificent tapestry of silver and charcoal, seemed to absorb the weak light, making its silhouette both distinct and yet somehow ethereal against the pristine canvas of freshly fallen snow. Elias's heart, a muscle usually accustomed to the slow, steady rhythm of arduous labor, leapt within his chest, a frantic, wild drumbeat echoing a familiar primal fear. His first unbidden instinct, sharp and immediate, was to protect his dwindling flock, those few remaining sheep that represented the last, fragile vestiges of his livelihood. He had lost too many lambs in the previous autumn, to coyotes, to the harsh whims of the wild, and the sight of a wolf, the apex predator, ignited a cold, familiar dread. He paused, his hand hovering near the rifle hanging just inside the kitchen door, his mind already racing through the familiar motions of defense. Yet the wolf did not move. It stood motionless as a statue carved from ice, its amber gold eyes sharp and unnervingly intelligent, fixed not on the nervous, huddled forms of the sheep, but seemingly directly on Elias himself. There was an unnerving stillness in its posture, a lack of predatory tension, no telltale crouch or twitch that would precede a charge. It simply watched, a silent, ancient gaze that seemed to penetrate the very layers of Elias's weary soul. The air, already thick with the crisp scent of pine and frozen earth, seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, a silent challenge, or perhaps something far more complex. Elias, gripping the worn doorframe, found himself caught in an unexpected stasis, his fear momentarily overridden by a profound, almost hypnotic curiosity. This was not the typical furtive glance of a predator scouting its next meal. This was something else entirely, a presence that demanded not just caution, but observation. Instead of immediately rushing out, rifle in hand, to drive the animal off, a deeply ingrained response born of generations of farmers battling the wilderness, Elias found himself simply watching. He leaned against the rough-hewn doorframe, the biting cold seeping through his threadbare work shirt, and observed. The wolf remained for several hours, a silent, unmoving sentinel, a living sculpture against the stark backdrop of snow and skeletal trees. It didn't attempt to breach the sturdy, if aging, fence line. It made no move to harass the sheep, who, initially agitated, had slowly settled, their bleats softening to mere murmurs. The wolf simply observed, its wild, intelligent gaze sweeping across the vast, frozen landscape, then back to the farm, to Elias, with a peculiar, almost knowing intensity. This behavior, so utterly contrary to everything Elias had ever been taught about wolves, everything he had experienced, puzzled him deeply. It was an anomaly, a crack in the solid foundation of his ingrained beliefs. and with each passing minute, it chipped away, subtly but persistently, at his long-held visceral fear. He wondered what it sought, what kept it rooted there, a lone, powerful entity in the vast silence. A profound, undeniable shift was beginning to stir within him, an understanding that perhaps the wilderness held more than just threats, an assertion that his world, for all its stark realities, was on the cusp of an unexpected, undeniable transformation. Days later, the memory of the wolf's unwavering gaze still clung to Elias, a persistent phantom in his periphery. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a trick of the light, or perhaps the animal's momentary confusion, but the image remained. It was a stark contrast to the familiar, desperate scrabbling of coyotes or the lumbering, destructive curiosity of a black bear. This wolf had possessed a gravitas that unnerved him, a silent authority that defied his simple understanding of predator and prey. The true shift in his perception, however, began with Jedediah. Jedediah Croft was a man whose presence was as unwelcome as a late-season frost. He owned the adjacent, smaller parcel of land, a perpetually unkempt stretch that mirrored the disarray of his own life. Jedediah was a scrapper, a man with a perpetually aggrieved air, whose primary income seemed to derive from poaching deer and small game, often venturing onto Elias's property. He was a man whose eyes, small and beady, always held a glint of resentment, a deep-seated bitterness that Elias suspected was as much directed at himself as it was at the world. Jedediah coveted Elias's fertile pastureland, a fact he made no secret of, occasionally muttering threats or making thinly veiled suggestions about Elias giving up the ghost on the farm. It was a blustery afternoon, the kind that promised snow, when Elias heard the distinct metallic snip of wire cutters near his western fence line. His heart immediately seized with a cold anger. Jedediah. Always Jedediah. Elias dropped the wrench he was using to tighten a loose bolt on his ancient tractor and grabbed his hunting rifle from its rack by the door, its familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who knew his land, circling around the rise to catch Jedediah in the act. But as Elias peered over the crest, he froze. Jedediah was indeed there, hunched over the fence, a section of wire already severed. Yet he wasn't moving. He stood utterly rigid, his broad shoulders hunched, his head craned upwards. His face, usually ruddy with exertion or irritation, was ashen, drained of all color, his eyes wide with a terror Elias had never seen in the man. Jedediah let out a choked gasp, a sound halfway between a whimper and a curse, then stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. He scrambled to his feet, dropping the wire cutters with a clatter, and fled, not even glancing back. He plunged into the dense thicket of pines, muttering frantically about devil eyes and the shadow beast, his voice barely audible over the rising wind, before disappearing completely. Elias, bewildered, lowered his rifle. He waited, listening to the retreating sounds of Jedediah's panicked flight. When silence returned, broken only by the whistling wind, he cautiously approached the fence. The wire was indeed cut, but beside the fresh break, deeply imprinted in the soft, damp earth, were tracks. Large tracks. Wolf tracks. And not just one set. They circled the area where Jedediah had been, a silent, unmistakable perimeter. They were the same size, the same distinctive pattern as those he'd seen near the pasture days ago. A shiver, not of fear but of profound intrigue, traced its way down Elias's spine. It wasn't just coincidence. The wolf had been there. It had seen Jedediah, and Jedediah, for all his bluster and aggression, had been terrified. The flicker of intrigue Elias had felt before now ignited into a small, steady flame of wonder. He looked out towards the distant snow-capped peaks, a new question forming in his mind. Was it possible that the wilderness, which had always seemed to demand so much, could also, in its own inscrutable way, offer protection? The thought was radical, unsettling, yet undeniably compelling. The quiet days that followed were punctuated by the relentless, grinding pressure from the outside world. A formal letter from the bank arrived, its crisp white paper a stark contrast to the rough texture of Elias's calloused hands. It detailed overdue payments, interest accruals, and a final ominous date for foreclosure if a substantial sum wasn't received. Elias reread it countless times, each word a hammer blow to his already beleaguered spirit. He tried to call, but the conversation was cold, impersonal, filled with legal jargon and unyielding deadlines. "Business is business, Mr. Thorne," the voice on the other end had said, devoid of any empathy for the man clinging to his ancestral land. The thought of losing the farm, his family's legacy, the very soil that held the memories of his father and grandfather, was a constant gnawing pain, sharper than any physical ache. He would sit by the crackling fire in the evenings, staring into the dancing flames, seeing not warmth but the flickering images of generations of Thornes, their faces etched with the same stubborn determination he now possessed, wondering if he would be the one to finally let it all crumble. Compounding this financial despair was the increasingly ominous weather. The local radio station, usually a source of folksy tunes and mundane updates, had turned grave. A particularly brutal winter storm, a once-in-a-decade blizzard, was forecast to hit. Meteorologists spoke of unprecedented snowfalls, plummeting temperatures, and sustained gale-force winds. Elias knew what that meant for his livestock. His small flock of sheep, already thinned by the previous harsh winter, were his last tangible asset, his last hope. They were vulnerable, and a storm of that magnitude threatened to decimate them entirely. He felt utterly alone, the weight of impending failure pressing down on him, a physical burden on his shoulders. He walked the perimeter of his land, checking fences, securing outbuildings, his breath pluming in the increasingly bitter air, each task a desperate act against an overwhelming tide. He muttered to himself, not quite prayers but pleas to the indifferent sky, to the ancient spirits of the land, for just one more chance, one reprieve. The silence of the wilderness, usually a comfort, now felt heavy, judgmental. Over the following weeks, as the days grew shorter and the air grew colder, a subtle, almost imperceptible change began to unfold around the Thorne farm. Elias, ever watchful, ever attuned to the rhythm of his land, started to notice things. The telltale howls of coyotes, once a regular nightly chorus from the distant ridges, grew fainter, then ceased altogether. The occasional unnerving rustle in the underbrush that signaled the presence of a lone bear foraging for late-season berries or fallen nuts no longer materialized. His sheep, though still huddled together against the biting cold, seemed strangely unmolested. There were no signs of attempted breaches, no frantic bleats in the dead of night, no carcasses discovered in the morning. It was as if an invisible perimeter had been drawn around his property, a silent, unacknowledged ward. And then there was the wolf. Now it was a familiar silhouette, no longer a startling apparition. Elias would catch glimpses of it, usually at a distance, a silent, watchful presence on the ridges surrounding his land. Sometimes it would be perched on a rocky outcrop, its magnificent form stark against the pale sky, its amber eyes sweeping across the fields. Other times, it would be a fleeting shadow at the edge of the forest, melting into the shadows before Elias could properly focus. It never approached the farmhouse, never threatened the livestock. It simply was. A constant wild presence. Elias, initially dismissive, then cautiously curious, now found himself wondering, could it be? Could this creature, this symbol of wild danger, be the reason for the sudden, eerie calm? He wrestled with the notion, his rational mind trying to find other explanations. A change in prey patterns, other hunters in the area. But the evidence, subtle yet persistent, pointed to the wolf. A quiet, unspoken pact seemed to be forming, an understanding that transcended language, a strange, almost symbiotic relationship where the wild, in its own inscrutable way, was offering a form of guardianship. He started leaving out scraps of leftover stew just outside the barn, a small, tentative offering to this silent protector. An act that would have been unthinkable just weeks prior. He didn't see the wolf take them, but the scraps were always gone by morning. The predicted blizzard struck with a vengeance, a force of nature so overwhelming it felt biblical. It began with a sudden, violent drop in temperature, followed by an insidious, swirling snowfall that quickly intensified. Within hours, the farm was buried under feet of snow, the familiar landscape transformed into a vast, featureless white expanse. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the eaves of the old farmhouse, rattling windows and sculpting monstrous drifts against every obstacle. Visibility dropped to mere yards, the world outside becoming a maelstrom of white fury. Elias could feel the cold seeping through the very walls, an omnipresent, insidious enemy. The access road, his only link to the outside world, became impassable within the first day, swallowed by drifts that towered higher than his head. He tried to clear it with his old tractor, a faithful, sputtering relic that had served his family for decades. He coaxed it to life, the engine groaning in protest against the cold, and managed a few passes, the plow churning through the heavy snow. But then, with a sickening lurch and a final metallic groan, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Elias spent hours in the biting wind, his fingers numb, trying to diagnose the problem. But it was no use. The old machine, like so much else, had finally given out. He stood there, defeated, watching the snow bury it even deeper, a monument to his helplessness. With the tractor gone and feed running perilously low, his sheep were in grave danger. He had enough hay for another day, maybe two, if he rationed it severely. The temperatures plummeted to dangerous lows, threatening to freeze the very blood in their veins. He spent hours in the barn, trying to shore up drafts, piling extra straw, huddling with the animals, his own body heat a meager offering against the encroaching cold. Despair, cold and sharp, gripped him tighter than ever before, a clawing sensation in his gut. He was cut off, alone, and facing the imminent loss of everything. He thought of his father, of his grandfather, and felt a profound, aching shame. He was failing them. He was failing the land. The storm wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It felt like a judgment, a final crushing blow. Under the cover of the raging blizzard, Jedediah, a man driven by opportunistic malice, saw Elias's isolation not as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. He had been watching, lurking in the periphery, his mind churning with a bitter satisfaction as the storm intensified. He knew Elias was cut off, that the road was impassable, that the old tractor was probably useless in such conditions. Elias was vulnerable, utterly alone. The perfect moment. Jedediah had long harbored a festering resentment, a belief that Elias had somehow cheated him or simply didn't deserve the land he held. This storm, he reasoned, was an act of providence, a chance to finally drive Elias off his land for good. He intended to rustle the remaining sheep, to leave Elias with nothing, forcing him to abandon the farm. With the wind howling and the snow obliterating all sound and sight, he believed himself unseen, unheard, and utterly unchallenged. He moved like a shadow, a malevolent spirit amidst the storm's fury, his face set in a malicious grin, already tasting the bitter victory. Elias, meanwhile, was a ghost of himself in the barn. The air was thick with the warm, earthy scent of sheep and straw, but the cold still found its way in, a persistent, insidious enemy. He was frantically trying to keep his remaining sheep warm, moving among them, pulling stray lambs closer to their mothers, whispering reassurances to their frightened bleats. His hands were raw, his body aching with cold and exhaustion, his mind a whirlwind of desperate calculations and grim possibilities. The wind outside roared, a deafening primal sound that seemed to mock his efforts. He was so engrossed in his desperate task, so focused on the survival of his small flock, that he didn't hear Jedediah approach until the barn door, not properly latched against the blizzard's force, suddenly burst open with a violent gust of wind and a shower of snow. Jedediah stood framed in the doorway, a hulking, malevolent silhouette against the swirling white chaos. His face was contorted into a triumphant, sneering grin, his eyes glinting with a predatory satisfaction. "Well, well, Thorn," he slurred, his voice rough, thick with cheap whiskey and malicious glee. "Looks like your luck finally ran out. Time to say goodbye to your precious woolies." In his hand, he gripped a rusty, heavy iron pipe, its end glinting menacingly in the dim light of Elias's lantern. Jedediah raised the pipe, not yet striking, but the threat was clear, unmistakable. Elias straightened, his body trembling, a surge of adrenaline momentarily overriding his exhaustion. He looked from Jedediah's hateful face to the pipe, then to his huddled sheep, a fierce, protective instinct igniting within him. He was ready to fight, to defend his last remaining hope, even if it meant his own end. But before Jedediah could take another step, before Elias could even formulate a desperate countermove, A sudden guttural snarl, deep and resonant, echoed through the barn, cutting through the din of the blizzard like a thunderclap. Both men froze, their eyes snapping to the barn's entrance. There, standing perfectly framed in the doorway, its magnificent form silhouetted against the swirling snow, was the grey wolf. Its eyes, those intelligent amber-gold orbs, now glowed with an ancient, unwavering intensity, reflecting the lantern light with an almost supernatural fire. It wasn't a low growl, but a primal warning, a sound that vibrated through the very bones of the barn, a force so powerful, so utterly untamed, that it froze Jedediah in his tracks. He gasped, his malicious grin dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The wolf did not move to attack, did not lunge, it simply stood, a living embodiment of the wild. Its presence alone, a formidable, undeniable barrier. Jedediah, a man steeped in crude superstitions and a deep-seated fear of the unknown, saw not an animal, but a devil beast, a vengeful spirit conjured by the storm. His face paled further, his eyes wide with a terror that stripped him of all his bluster. With a choked cry, a sound of pure, abject fear, he dropped the rusty pipe, which clattered loudly on the wooden floor. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, then scrambled out into the raging blizzard, his screams swallowed almost instantly by the wind, his desperate, panicked flight disappearing into the white maelstrom. Elias stood trembling, his heart still hammering against his ribs, the cold fear slowly receding, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shock and awe. He watched Jedediah's retreating form vanish, then slowly, cautiously turned to face the wolf. The animal remained in the doorway, its breath pluming, its eyes still fixed on him. There was no aggression in its gaze now, no predatory hunger, but something far more profound. It was an understanding, a shared moment of raw, primal connection forged in the heart of the storm. In that moment, as the wind howled its mournful song and the snow piled higher, Elias knew with an absolute certainty that resonated deep within his soul. This wolf wasn't a threat, it was a protector. It had been his silent guardian, his unseen deterrent, and now his undeniable salvation. Slowly, deliberately, Elias reached for something in his pocket. It was a piece of cured venison, his last precious reserve, saved for a moment of extreme need, a meager comfort against the bleakness. He held it out, his hand steady despite the tremor in his body, offering it to the wolf. It was an act of profound trust, a gesture of gratitude and nascent respect. The wolf watched his hand, its head cocked slightly, its eyes never leaving Elias's. Then, with a fluid grace, it stepped further into the barn, approached Elias cautiously and gently, almost delicately, took the meat from his outstretched hand. It turned, its powerful jaws closing around the offering, and retreated a few steps, settling down just inside the doorway, its amber eyes still fixed on Elias. A silent pact, ancient and wordless, had been forged in the crucible of the blizzard, a bond between man and wild, a promise whispered on the wind. As the wolf ate, its movements deliberate and calm, Elias noticed something he hadn't seen before. Above its left eye, partially obscured by its thick fur, was a distinctive crescent-shaped scar, a pale mark against its darker coat. His breath hitched. A memory, long buried under layers of toil and despair, resurfaced with startling clarity. His grandfather, a man of few words but rich stories, had spoken of it. Of a legend, passed down through generations of thorns, of a lone wolf, a spirit of the north, marked by just such a scar. A guardian, the tales claimed, that had once saved their ancestors from starvation during a forgotten, particularly brutal winter, guiding them to game, driving off other predators, a silent, wild protector. It wasn't just any wolf. This was a lineage, a recurring guardian, tied by some ancient mystical thread to his family's history, to the very land they occupied. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, yet it was a comforting one, a warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away the last vestiges of cold despair. His salvation wasn't just from Jedediah or the immediate threat of the blizzard. It was a salvation from the crushing isolation, the spiritual despair that had threatened to consume him, the feeling of being utterly alone against an indifferent world. The wolf, this magnificent wild creature, was a tangible link to his past, a living embodiment of the resilience woven into his very blood, a reminder that he was not, and had never truly been alone. The land had always provided, in ways he had forgotten to see. With the silent, watchful presence of the wolf now a constant, reassuring anchor in his life, Elias found a renewed strength he hadn't known he possessed. The blizzard eventually broke, receding to reveal a landscape transformed, pristine and silent, but the spirit of the storm had left an indelible mark on Elias. He repaired his old tractor, not just patching it up, but meticulously overhauling it, his hands working with a newfound purpose. He secured his farm, mending fences with a vigor he hadn't felt in years, reinforcing outbuildings, preparing for the next challenge with a proactive resolve. He even discovered new, more sustainable ways to manage his land, drawing on old forgotten wisdom from his grandfather's journals, methods that respected the natural cycles rather than fighting against them. He began to rotate pastures more carefully, to plant native grasses that enriched the soil, to build small windbreaks that protected his sheep more effectively. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a steward, working in harmony with the wild forces that surrounded him. The wolf, his silent guardian, remained a part of his life. It never became a pet, never truly domesticated, and Elias never sought to tame it. It was a wild, free spirit, often seen at a distance, a majestic silhouette on a ridge, its amber eyes occasionally meeting his across the vast expanse of his fields. It embodied the untamed beauty of the land, the raw, ancient power of the wilderness, and the deep, often forgotten connection between man and nature. Elias Thorne had found his salvation not in conquering the wild, nor in isolating himself from it, but in the unexpected, profound bond with a creature of the wild. He had rekindled a forgotten heritage, rediscovered the strength of his ancestors, and found a profound, undeniable sense of purpose that resonated with the very heartbeat of the land. His farm, once a symbol of his despair, now thrived, a testament to resilience, understanding, and the enduring, mysterious hand of the wild.